all, I'm intrigued by Paul's contribution as to which party it would be in Spain that should have been responsible for introducing the dictatorship of the proletariat, because as far as I can see, none of them are capable of it. And as for the lack of a party, first of all I should say that the FAI, Albanian Anarchist Federation, was a specifically anarchist organisation which was created in 1927, not as a party, but as an attempt to actually recapture the spirit of anarchism within the CND, which was being threatened by various reformist elements. And they succeeded in doing this up until 1931. Basically, the FAI were the action groups, the defence groups, and the defence committees of the CND who were attempting to counter the reformist policies of the notable leadership. By 1931-32, they succeeded in that, and basically they then gave up the FAI, and because the problem was that there were people who came along who had their eye on power, and they saw the FAI as an organisation which they could take advantage of, and which they could turn into a political party, which is in effect what they did from 1932 to 1933 onwards, up until 1926. And this was a major contribution to the subversion of the revolutionary process in July, from July 19 onward, because it had become an institution. Whereas the defence committees, the CND5, they were the activist groups, and they were the ones who were actually out on the streets in Barcelona and in Valencia and in the south, who were attacking the barracks. It wasn't the leadership of the FAI. Should the anarchists taken power with any chance? Well, they should certainly have cut out the regional committees and the national committee. The big problem, as I see it, was the failure of the Durruti column and the Ortiz column to take Saragossa in August 1936. And the reason they did this, I mean, there were countless reasons. The main problem was they were starved of arms and ammunition. They were advised by the military advisor who were imposed by the Generalitat that they should advance on Saragossa until their flanks were covered, which is a load of nonsense. The Generalitat was more afraid of the Durruti columns, the militias, because had Durruti succeeded in liberating Saragossa, which had 30,000 CNT militants, they could have then taken over, they could have occupied the whole of industrial Spain, and that would have been a catastrophe as far as the bourgeoisie were concerned. And it was Durruti's dream, after having liberated Saragossa, to take Navarre, to take Galicia, and into the Basque country, which would have given the whole of that area, it brought it under the activist element of the anarchist movement, the CND, the rank and file, not of the leadership. And that's what the leadership were desperately afraid of. They were losing power. And that was why they undermined the only really genuine revolutionary institution during the Spanish Revolution, and that was the Council of Aragon, which they succeeded in destroying, and they helped to establish in August 1937. So the revolutionary period lasted from July 1956, ended finally with the collapse of the Council of Aragon in August 1937. And it would have made a difference, according to the why is the American blockade of the Republic seldom mentioned? I'm afraid that I can't answer that. Why is the murder of an anarchist coup leaders by Soviet babies not mentioned? Well, there really isn't enough time. I mean, there's just so much going on the murder of Lenin by the old group and the KGB. In fact, I was in prison in Alpha Island Islands, which was the prison from which Lenin was kidnapped. Can you tell us how you plan to kill Franklin? Last time I gave that away, I ended up being #1 cook in the old building. The plan was, I mean, the one that I was involved in was the last of perhaps 46 attempts on France's life, and it was unsuccessful, as you probably know. The idea was we had various contacts, and Franco was to be targeted at the football stadium of Santiago Bernabeu. Originally, at the cup final, that had to be deferred for various reasons. And the idea was that one of the contacts was a carpenter who was working on the Royal Box. So when it came to the cup final, then the whole box would go, including all the cohorts and basically the key people in the regime. But unfortunately, what I didn't understand was the extent to which the exile movement had been infiltrated by the secret police and was also collaborating with both the French and the British secret services. There's a big problem in 1964 was the OES were operating from Spain, targeting de Gaulle, and the Defence Interior, which was the organisation which I was involved, was targeting Franco from France. So the secret services of both countries were doing a quid pro quo. I mean, as with all exile organisations throughout history, they are #1 targets for infiltration and for manipulation. So when I arrived in Madrid, they were waiting for me. I probably did very good for the anti-Francoist movement by being caught, I'm sure. Do you think that the struggle for independence in the Basque Country and Catalonia is progressive? Well, it's certainly, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you're talking about ETA, the original ETA, because the ETA, which operated from the mid-1980s to the 90s, well, more recently, I certainly don't have a great deal of time for. Are there any other questions?
There's a few.
Right. Is there anyone else have any other answer would like me to answer?
Why and how did the Catalan anarchists gain control?
Why
and how did the Catalan anarchists gain control?
Well, that was probably one of the great mistakes made by the movement by allowing the Catalan region to dominate the revolutionary process in Spain. And it led them into direct conflict with some of the Aragonese lands. And as I said, they were desperate to minimise the influence of the Council of Aragon. There was just a lot of national tension between the Catalans, and the people of Aragon. And how they came to dominate the movement is a question that I can't answer. There was a great mistake along that happened in the first place.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that.
Is there any final comments from you?
I would take too long. We'll 5 minutes.
Someone asked if most literature of the Spanish Civil War is romanticised. I mean, depends what you mean. I think the answer is simply no. I mean, there's a vast amount of research being done in the Spanish Civil War. Most of it not from my position, but you have to recognise some very, very good works of history out there which you can learn a lot from. I don't think it is a problem that they're romanticised. Is the struggle of Basque and Catalan independence progressive? Should be supported? The answer is yes, twice. Next one. Mentioned the American blockade. Well, I don't really mean that. There was an American blockade. What there was the non-intervention pact. The non-intervention pact was proposed by France, urged by Britain, and was set up in the end of August 1936. It was a pact of different powers. About 36, I think, signed it. The main players inside the non-intervention committee were Britain and France, the Soviet Union, Fascist Italy, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, Fascist Italy and Hitler's Germany. the last three were intervening. And what it did, in fact, was to, the only people that applied non-intervention really were the liberal democracies, whose boats, whose navies patrolled the Republican zone to stop arms getting in. These are the same powers the Republic was doing everything the police stations being supported by. Of course, the fascist powers were completely cynical on this question and ignored the non-intervention pact, as did the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union's aid was not as great as the fascists' aid. The Americans didn't actually take part in the non-intervention pact, but did have a law where they applied a law where American companies would not intervene by sending military hardware. And what in fact happened wasn't a blockade. They sent, in fact, they allowed American companies to trade with Franco. So Texaco and other American firms sent Franco vehicles, petrol, and so on and so forth. They actually did support send aid, not the American government, which remained neutral, but American countries, so it had the same effect. What was the English contribution to the Civil War? Well, of course, the main contribution was, well, there were two things about this solidarity which took place. One was the international days, which was mentioned by a speaker. I think it was an important part. I mean, there are dozens, not hundreds of different issues we could have mentioned, of course, when we talk about this conflict. One is the working class internationalism. The international brigades were set up by the Communist International, although they projected them as a Popular Front organisation, but effectively they were controlled by the communists. And the English contribution was sent about 2,500 volunteers. Most, not all of them communists, the majority were. About 700 were killed. The rest, most of them were wounded. And this was fairly typical of all the brigades that the volunteers that went. About 30,000 foreigners fought in the international brigades. Let's make a very quick point about that. I mean, obviously these were dominated by the Communist Party. There is a point to be made about that, which I think is quite interesting. Most historians don't really look at. Is the contradiction in this, because if you read some of the memoir material, especially the letters written at the time, you see again and again how a lot of these fighters saw themselves as fighting for socialism. This, over time, has been covered up as a fight for democracy, that was the official line. But they themselves saw that as a tactical question. This is quite an interesting point, actually, how the communists saw themselves both inside and outside Spain. It wasn't just a monolith of people who yes, we're just for democracy. It was much more complex, and it was reflected the situation of which they were in, which was one of working class revolution. There were also volunteers who fought with the militia. There was a small group of the Independent Labour Party fought with POOM, and there were probably a couple of thousand foreigners who fought with the CNT, and there were other foreigners who fought with several hundred other foreigners who fought with POOM, apart from a small British group. So the English contribution was that on the one hand, on the other hand, massive campaign of solidarity, which again was normal in all the democratic, bourgeois democratic countries, massive working class support for the Republic, and the raising of funds, and food, and so on and so forth, taking in refugee children, a really tremendous, one of the most dramatic examples of working class internationalism. Of course, this was really where the Republic, or the revolution, to be precise, was going to get its support internationally, not from the democratic governments, but of course from working class people throughout the world, which took up the support for the Republic in the fight against fascism. And how did the Catalan annexing gain control? As Stuart mentioned, I'll just perhaps make a couple of comments more about that. I think that what we have to understand there, it depends what the question really means. I mean, what happens in the sense is a process whereby at the beginning of the Republic, as Stuart's book on the Fire explains, which I recommend people to read, the more radical elements take over the CNT, mainly, but basically because of the massive level of class struggle and how that reflected the radicalisation of the working class, and because the Catalonia at that point in time was, where you had nearly 50% of industry, therefore 50% of the working class, had amazing weight inside both Spanish capitalism and Spanish working class, and at the same time it is the stronghold of the CNT. So, it's a fairly understandable process. It would be the Catalan anarchists which were most dominant in the CNT, as has been the case more or less throughout the history of the CNT, even today with the various remnants of the left. Just to make a few general points to finish on this question about state and party and so on and so forth in the CNT. I mean, as I said, I don't agree with Stuart on the question of this. I think there's too much of a rigid division between leaders and rank and file majors. So I don't think it's such a clear cut thing. For example, the question of participation in the Spanish Republican government was taken by an assembly of 400 delegates from the front and various committees, and then from activists. And it's really presented to them as being a headless alternative. But if they didn't do that, they wouldn't get arms and so on and so forth, the fascists were breaking through. I think it's much more the problem, the dilemma they had, which I tried to draw out, is the practicality of the problem. This does tie into the question of the state and so on, and whether there should be some other form of state. I think it was a much more general problem, rather than just the degeneration of the leaders, although it's certainly the case that some leaders in the CNT moved very rapidly into pragmatism. Others, it's more complex. Others were, if you look at the CNT press, Solidaridad Obrera is still defending the revolution. At the same time, its leaders are taken by the government. There's a sort of dual thing there. There's a conflict whereby, for example, on May 37, once the revolution had been really was one of the final, prior to the dissolving the Aragon Council, which was in August, but the key moment the fighting in the streets of Barcelona. One of the consequences of that was CNT removed from the Republican government, because they were no longer needed, of course, and that produces a division inside the leadership of the CNT. So I don't think it's such a straightforward question. I think the problem is much more a deeper ideological one, which is one I'm trying to draw out, because I think there is a need to have a dialogue with anarchist ideas. I don't think, and when there's a problem, that's why I said about the question of the words leadership and revolution. Let's make it clear in case someone's beginning to doubt. I actually am in favour of the revolutionary party and revolutionary leadership. But I think, when we talk to people, when we talk to thousands of people under activities, especially in Spain itself where I live, and I've lived half of my life, it's not good enough. We can't just polemicise using a certain sort of, we've got a codified language, we understand what we're talking about. You have to understand where people are coming from, and you have to try and engage them in a dialogue to try and win them over. You have to try and engage them about the key issues. So I do think the question of language is important. That's why socialist work is called socialist work. It's not called proletarian revolutionary work. It's called socialist work. The word socialist, for example, in Spain is an insult. Comrade tomorrow speaking, recommend you to go to a very interesting meeting on the youth rebellion in Spain at 11:45, and he puts in the programs of the Catalan socialists. Now we know what that means in Britain. Socialist is someone who stands for socialism, who's probably a revolutionary, at least who's definitely for transforming society. See, if you saw that word in Catalan, it means it's some social democratic traitor that wants to do you in. So, the question of language and context is important. And it is important if you find yourself in a situation, which we find ourselves in, of having a mass movement that says, we don't want no parties and no unions in our movement. So, what are we going to do? We're going to run, the sectarians will run away from that movement. Some groups, in fact, which we work with, we're in a coalition of various anti-capitalist groups, at least 2 of the groups in that have refused to take part because they can't go there with their own initials. Now, we, quite correctly, have taken part. Our comrades are playing a leading role in it, but they've done it, but they have to go and actually argue their ideas. They have to accept that they cannot charge into the square in Catalonia with their paper because they just get thrown out the other side. You have to actually go and argue for your ideas and win people round and get in a position where you can actually begin to influence people. And we have, around the movement, we have our own propaganda and stores, for example. People come and ask us, oh, you're a political party. And I say, no, we're not. Because what do they mean by political party? They mean you're sort of bourgeois, right-wing, conservative, social democratic party, or, these people in suits who are cutting our wages and making us unemployed and so forth. So, if you say, yes, we are, and you have to understand there are different types of parties, you're not going to get very far. So you have to start a dialogue. We say we're an anti-capitalist organisation. We're trying to explain what that means, And the result is, we've got masses of contacts. We're selling hundreds of papers. There's not a real problem with that. But it doesn't depend on how you approach. So that's why I made the point about, the question of some of the language we use, which are perfectly understandable between those of us, being in revolutionary socialist organisations for most of our life, but may not be that understandable to all these thousands of young people who are coming into activity in Spain and we hope in other parts of the world. You have to talk about the issue. And the issue is the question of what happens to the revolution. What happens when you make the revolution without making some form of alternative power? From Spain is the example. That's what is really aimed to get to the question of state. What happens when there's no coordination between the most active elements? That's the question of leadership, and I think that's the way we have to pose it to the people who are attracted to anarchist ideas. We also have to understand why they're attracted to anarchist ideas. We in the international social tradition have a clear understanding of the generation of Stalinism and so forth and so on. But we're alone in that. Most other Marxist organisations don't have that understanding and are soft on Stalinism or think that the Soviet Union was a socialist country for decades, etc., etc. Academics talk about when they talk about Marxism, or the media, Marxism and Stalinism is all the same thing. We've got a real problem. We have to bear that in mind, I think, when we begin to start to explain our ideas. So, just to finish on this, overrunning a bit, on the question of CNT, a final point about this. I mean, the thing about the CNT, and why it is such an important organisation in the history of the revolutionary movement, it's a mass working class organisation. And because of that, in the revolutionary situation, it began to split all over the place in terms of what should happen, because of the crisis, because of the terribly difficult situation they had. And one of the things that happens are members of the libertarians to actually come to the conclusion you did need some form of state. The Amigos de Baruch, the Friends of the Baruch, which is the radical anarchist group, which was against collaboration with the bourgeois parties, argued in May 37 that the surely revolutionary juntas made up of themselves, the CNT and the POUM and so on, which should reimpose the revolution, remove the bourgeois government and so on and so forth. They came to that conclusion through their own experience of struggle. So it's a whole complex process there, which I think we can learn a lot from. Thank you.